This is a special lecture. It's never occurred before that there are 53 weeks in a year, but we can't break the continuity of the cycle. And so I have put in this place a complete overview so that you can understand some of the genesis of this education, some of its effectiveness, and its radical quality. This education began in 1965, and at that time I had been out of university for a couple of years and had decided, because of the perennial habitual graduate student syndrome, to go back to college. And in order to go back, you have to take a thing called the graduate record exam, the GRE. I made the mistake of scoring very high on that, too high on that, and they put me in a very strange position. They gave me the prize teaching assistantship at San Francisco State. It paid, which 30 years ago was a fantastic sum, about $1,000 a semester, which was very adequate to live on in the student way in which I was living. I think my share of rent in the apartment was about $70 a month at that time, so you can imagine. And they assigned me to a new professor, Rabbi Alvin Fine, who was the rabbi for the congregation Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco, the largest synagogue in San Francisco, at where Clay Street runs into Arguello, out by the Presidio. As a congregation, had at that time about 10,000 people. Very large synagogue. Moorish fountains and tile and very plush. And he had been forced to retire because of a heart condition. But being only 53 at the time, he refused to retire. And so he became a humanities professor. And he was new, and I was assigned to him. And within a couple of weeks, he had a relapse. And he ended up in the hospital for a couple of months. And I had to take his teaching load. I was 25 years old. I was not an intellectual. I did not speak. I had never spoken. I didn't like speaking. I didn't like anything at all about the whole situation. I wanted to be left alone to play with ideas. But I was forced to take his load. 2 graduate seminars, one on Maimonides and one on Martin Buber, and an undergraduate class that had about 300 people in it on styles of civilization, Humanities 1A. When he came back after 2 months, I was driving him back to his office, and in his gravelly Organian voice, he said to me, "You've grown insightful." I gave him the Gary Cooper wave, and I said, "I'm glad you're back, Rabbi. I can't take it." Because not only were his students coming, but his congregation was still coming for advice to the office, and I was there, and they would say, You're supposed to give advice?" So after 2 months of that, I fortunately had been able to get through it. And the department that I was in an interdisciplinary major. There were only 3 places in the United States that offered that at the time: Columbia, the University of Chicago, and San Francisco State. And those of you who know the University of Chicago, I wasn't interested in arguing about whether something existed or not just because you said it existed or just because someone didn't notice that it did exist. The intellectual atmosphere of the University of Chicago in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s was proverbial. It was a madhouse of precision leading nowhere. Columbia, of course, being in New York City, was not the place I really wanted to be, so I ended up at San Francisco State. And I ended up in this peculiar position. I had proved myself capable, and so they said, in order to keep your prize teaching assistantship, you have to teach, and since you can teach, you'll have to teach a course, not just be a teaching assistant. So they said, you'll have the opportunity, aren't you glad, to design a course and offer it. what is your offering? And I had no idea. I thought I was off the hook. I thought I was back shooting pool. So I offered a course, unfortunately, on the Italian Renaissance, on the intellectual foundations of the Italian Renaissance, on Marsilio Ficino and the Platonic Academy in Florence. And in developing that course, I inadvertently had to show why the Renaissance was a product of this one school. That without that pilot light, without that school, there would have been no Renaissance. There would have been no modern world as we know it today. And in doing that, I had to show the pattern of thought of education. And in making that clear, I was unfortunately very successful. So they said, you will have a chance to design another course next semester. What will you offer? And so I thought I would go off the deep end so that they wouldn't ever ask me again. So I chose what in 1965 was one of the farthest out intellectual figures, Teilhard de Chardin. And I offered a course on the future evolution of the human species, according to Teilhard de Chardin. And I worked in some Nietzsche and some Bergson, some Aurobindo, and all kinds of things. And they said, fantastic. What's your next course? So all this time I'm trying to get out of it. And so I thought, I will offer a course that will be so refined, so erudite, I was 26 years old, that I will simply short-circuit the whole thing. So I offered a course called Job and Faust, Two Faces of Evil. And I found the original prospectus of it in 1966. Early 66, things were not too complicated. This is all you needed. And you went into the humanities office and you said, here it is. Where's my check? Unfortunately, Job and Faust was a smash hit. It was unbelievable. It was the talk of the campus. And I found myself, because of a whole string of these, quote, accomplishments, being singled out as the resident weirdo genius in San Francisco. And it didn't help that one of my roommates was the manager for the Steve Miller Band. And the Steve Miller Band lived in our apartment. And so I got this reputation as being some kind of a character. And so they finally decided that I was capable of designing almost any course. And they were thinking about keeping me permanently when the whole university was closed down. San Francisco State was closed because of student riots. Not just a few riots. There were 15,000 rioting people on the campus the day I took my written exams, and 5,000 police in riot gear and so forth. And the windows were all smashed while I was in the building, while I was taking the written exam. And the written exam, being a peculiar chance for everybody to get their digs in, because I was the only person graduated from 19,000 students that semester. I was chosen as an example that education is going to continue. It's going to go on. And my written exam was on Chinese poetry of the Tang Dynasty, centering on Du Fu, on medieval symbolism, centering on the Book of Kells, and on stream of consciousness language form, centering on William Faulkner. And this was very complicated material, as you can imagine, with tear gas canisters going off and the sound of shots all over the campus. Fortunately, my major professor was Chinese from Nanjing. Very small, very courageous individual, and as we were walking across the campus, he said, we have to deposit these written exams in the administration building, then it's official. Then you can take your orals. And in this Dante Inferno, I was really quavering. I thought I was brave, and I found out I was just good old American jelly by that time. And he calmed me down. He said, I want you to know that it can get worse than this. And I couldn't even say, oh. He said, I was a student in Nanjing when the Japanese came in. And he said, in order to show us who was boss, they machine gunned our professors before us and then closed the buildings. So out of all of this, I emerged as a kind of an oddball character in education. And I never intended to go on with it. I was just trying to survive and bide time. When San Francisco State opened again, the following semester, I inadvertently found out that I was not alerted to, my file was not put in the placement. And so I was not getting any job opportunities. Because of being the only person who graduated, there wasn't a file created on me because there was no administration at that time. And so I complained on the phone, and because of my reputation, they quickly said, well, what can we do? And I said, well, who's there today? And they said, somebody from Calgary is there. I didn't even know where Calgary was. It's in Canada. It's in Alberta. And so I demanded that, you know how you are when you're young. Well, get me an appointment. Well, he's leaving tomorrow. Well, get me an appointment today. It's today still. So I ended up over in Berkeley talking to a representative of a school from Calgary, Alberta. And it was an amazing experience because they were building a brand new type of school. They had all this oil money. Alberta was the Saudi Arabia of North America at that time. They had so much oil money that there were no income taxes for people in Alberta. Instead, the government wrote you checks for about $8,000 each. They had so much money that they built new hospitals and new schools and new roads everywhere. And so the school that he was interviewing for had not been built yet. In fact, it had never been built. No one had ever seen such a place. It was designed like a spaceship. 15 acres with no walls, just 3 big variant levels and all kinds of labyrinthian curves. And they wanted an interdisciplinary education, a pattern of 16 courses to be the operating synthesis and matrix for this whole school. The library, for instance, was going to be about 75% electronic, audiovisual. It was going to be interspersed in the building with information kiosks, and each student would have a Porta-Pack unit that they would be able to plug in to audio and video any place in the school. It was designed by Stanton Leggett Associates, who built the City College of Chicago up by O'Hare Field. Third hand, Le Corbusier architecture. Extremely poor taste, but they were building it, and I must have seemed like an odd character to him. Anyway, I got a letter within a week saying, we hope that you'll come on staff, and here are the blueprints to the place, which isn't built yet. And so you can use your imagination by reading the blueprints, and you can help design the courses. So this education that you're in got that kind of start, a very, very peculiar start. And so I went there. I went there in May of 1970, the 2 days after the Cambodian invasion. If you're old enough to remember that, you remember that universities across the United States simply drew a line and said, that's it. There were no classes on the Berkeley campus at all that next day. Every class that met, whether it's in engineering or math or literature or whatever, discussed the situation. That was the only subject of the day. I myself had taught a couple of courses at the classics section of Dwinell Hall, and in fact, I had taught the night that Wheeler Auditorium was burnt to the ground by rioters. And so I was a little tired of it, and I left, and I went to Canada and began working on what turns out to be this education that you have. I started in June of 1970, and by June of 1975, I had designed 9 of the 16 courses, and they had run. And they had run in such a way that they became almost like celebrity events. The symbols course would draw about 300 people, and because we had no offices, the area that I habituated in this huge, monstrous spaceship building had accumulated projects from about 4,000 or 5,000 students by that time. So I had a whole mountain. It was like an archaeological dig of paintings and various masks, and it was an incredible experience. And when people would be shown this building from around the world, they would come through in groups. They would always point out this creative mound. And I was sort of like this technological wizard hovering around this creative mound that grew every year. When I finally resigned, I resigned a tenured position. I was the only tenured professor ever to resign, in Canada at least. And it caused a great stir. The only thing I've ever saved from it was the double-page center spread of the student newspaper, because by that time the students were all convinced revolutionaries. I was several times taken aside and asked whether I was trying to take over the school, and I innocently said, "Who, me?" And the program at that time looked like this. I have a copy here which I'll put out and make available so that you can see. This is the typed up copy. And its 8 sections ran in the following way. The introductory course was divided into 3 different parts. And the first of the 3 parts was bifurcated. So there was a 1A and 1B. And the 1A was about symbolic consciousness and contemporary mythic man. And it was like one of these whirlwind surveys that was meant to simply not bowl over the student population, but simply to dazzle them. And part of the theory there, a theory that was developed most adequately by the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, we cannot get in contact with our spirit until the worldly quality of our illusion is dazed. We are so immersed in illusion, so immersed into habitual comportment, that until that is scrambled, until that is confused, there's no way to begin learning something new. And so the introductory course, 1A, was meant to dazzle. It was too much, it was so rich that there was no way that anyone could handle the flow, the massive tidal wave of material. Then 1B was called nature, so that it was like a 1-2 punch. The first semester was the dazzling part, and the second was simply to present nature and to keep comment to a minimum. In those days, the late 1960s, one of the favorite techniques was called text without comment. It was part of a program that we had in San Francisco called University Without Walls. University Without Walls, text without comment. It was kind of like French documentary cinema verite, where you just simply present the existential bare bones, and you let the challenge confrontation generate whatever it's going to generate, which is all right if you're a despairing intellectual, but it's not too good for people who are naive, mediocre human beings. What happens is that it doesn't have any taste for that kind of person, and they let it go. So instead of just the nature as text without comment, it was a survey of the latest qualities of research along with the basic nature. So we had nuclear physics, we had up-to-date medicine, we had biochemistry, botany, natural history, mathematics, everything. And that particular aspect of the education eventually became not only nature, but it became what is today science, the first and the eighth parts of the education of the course. The up-to-date quality of nature in terms of the scientific presentation was finally brought into this kind of a focus in the fall of 1989, Science and Our Spirit, a series of 13 lectures that presented the way in which science and nature meld together in a spiritual context, in a spiritual flow. This was one of the courses that I developed at this particular juncture to work not only at the Philosophic Research Society, that's where it was delivered, but also to help the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, where many of my very good friends operate, including the president of that institution. For instance, it began with Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics, and the blurb here is an explanation of the parallel between modern physics and Eastern mysticism. Then a little paperback from Hong Kong University Press, Li, Qi, and Xu, an examination of Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China. And it went on. We used Robert Oppenheimer, Science and Common Understanding, talking about atom and void in third millennium physics. And went on to Feynman's Quantum Electrical Dynamics, Richard Leakey's Origins, Gerald Edelman's Neural Darwinism, Stephen Tolman's Human Understanding, the astronauts who went to the moon, their book, First on the Moon, Galaxies by Timothy Ferris, The Double Helix by Watson, Chaos by James Glick. In other words, 5 years ago, this was an exceedingly cutting-edge resolution of what in 1970, 19 years before, had been emerged in the nature part of the course. So that nature and science were not distinguished at all 25 years ago in this education. They were in the first part, and the idea, the synthesizing idea that controlled their keeping together was the old Sufi idea that you cannot teach someone anything until they are confused, until their worldly ego is held in suspension. There's no way to bring something new in. So that in separating science from nature and putting them at the opposite ends of this course, it opened up the issue then of how you're going to get traction for something new for the student population. And so the whole quality of this challenge was shifted to the second course, which at that time already was rituals. Already by the 1970s, by 1975, it was nature, rituals, mythology, symbols. The first year was completely what it is now, only not so sophisticated and not so well polished, not so enriched, but it was there. And the rituals section became the place where the challenge was put. And that's where the mask assignment came in. By 1972, I realized that there had to be the existential challenge someplace in the second section. And since it wasn't in nature, since I had taken the confusing existential challenge out of nature, it had to be put into rituals. And that's where the Mass came in. One of the most influential authors at this time was a Belgian named Lommel, who was writing on ancient shamanism. And Lommel's researches convinced me to read Lucien Levy-Bruhl. And when I read Levy-Bruhl, I made the connection, the same connection that Jung made when he read Levy-Bruhl some 40 years before. Lucien Levy-Bruhl is one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. His basic genius was to try to understand the mind of so-called primitive man. And when one understands the mind of primitive man, you stop calling him primitive and you call him instead primordial. Because primitive man was not a stupid version of us. Primitive man was the genius version of evolution of his age. Not separated from us by any DNA structure whatsoever. We have the same DNA that so-called primitive man had. But his genius went into non-verbal awareness. So-called primitive man was an absolute genius at non-verbal awareness, which is why I call him primordial man. And Lucien Levy-Bruhl, my French is so pathetic that I can't even say two words. In English, it's participation mystique. Participation mystique. That was the flow quality of the genius of primordial qua primitive man. That he participated mystically in whatever he was doing. And that allowed him from the inside of that activity to direct it. And he directed it not by ideas, not even by language. He directed it by ritual harmonic movements called dance. And that the dance modulation, dance rhythm modulation, was his intellectual genius of navigating through the complexities of nature. And as soon as I understood that this was what Levy-Bruhl was getting at, I remembered a book by a German, a man named Helmut Jahn, a book called Muntu that was read in the early 1960s, a book about the genius of African society. That African religions and African society never developed a discursive philosophic system, but they put all of their intelligence into dances. And that African dances are highly intelligent in terms of the way in which dance rhythm changes and modulates and affects the human body, and out of that, radiation psychically affects the environment, affects the way in which nature occurs. Because it turns out that nature is very malleable. However we are, that's how it will be. It's not cause in a causal way, but it's resonance. It's a harmonic. And then I remembered that the Australian Aborigines also dealt with this kind of quality, that they had found certain musical tones, that the didgeridoo, in fact, as a musical instrument, was not to play melodic lines, but to touch certain notes that were untouchable by the normal human voice, in a sense of going very low and keeping it like a drone, like a Scottish bagpipe. And that these were like keys. These were oral sonor keys that then set the effective matrix for the dance. And that the dance movements then were the filigree of these various levels. All of this came about 1972 into the rituals section of the education. And I began to understand that the most basic tandem there was mask making and the use of those masks in a kind of a ceremonial dance. That once one had those two together, they could be symbolized by mask and drum. Once one had the mask and the drum, tandem, one had a leg up, as primordial man had had, on the way in which existence modulates with nature, and when existence goes left, nature goes left with you. It follows you. It goes along like a harmonic. All of the research that's been done in the world in this particular area are from the French. The French in the 1920s and 30s and 40s were absolute geniuses at understanding this. And the great synthesis of that was Claude Lévi-Strauss, his great book, The Savage Mind, which is one of the great books of our century. It's far greater than Freud's interpretation of dreams. The Savage Mind by Claude Lévi-Strauss is like one of those great documents of understanding this is how reality actually happens with our participation in it, even before there's any ideational quality whatsoever. To put it simply, the ideas are in the way the feet dance. And I remembered then, because I was doing the education in a way that I was not only offering the courses at the school, I was offering courses to the city at large. And at that time in 1972, I was developing the myth section especially, and I was teaching the mythology section at the Indian Friendship Center in downtown Calgary. We had about 110 Blackfoot and Stoney and Piegan Indians in the course, as well as about 100 people from the community, as well as about 90 people from the college. So there was this huge population. I brought in all kinds of native myth makers, storytellers. The best was a blind old man, about 100 years old, named Hanson's Bearpaw, who couldn't speak English, but he could tell the ancient stories about Tailfeather and all the Scarface and all the basic Algonquin myths in their exact original. And when he presented it, I don't know if I still have it here or not. It's probably gone now. I had a storytelling king from Cameroon, an African storytelling king, that when you have the right quality of rhythm, when you have the cadence transfers the dance step to language. So that the storyteller always has his cadence-keeping cane. It's true in Africa. It's true for the American Indians. It's true for ancient Greece. It's true for ancient Egypt. When you look at the staff that Thoth carries in the pyramid hieroglyphics, and you look at that staff, it's a storytelling staff. Thoth, the originator of language, originates the way in which the cadences of mystical participation of dance are transferred to language. And language then becomes a new medium, so that myth becomes another level, an even higher level than ritual. Myth becomes a higher level than ritual. But what's important, and this came out of the Algonquin tribe, what's important there to understand is that mythic language is not objective. Mythic language is fluid. It's always fluid. There is never one right way to tell a myth. The right way to tell the myth is how you are telling it now. However you are telling it now, if you do it right, that was it. If you do it in your cadence and you put it out in your form, then that's the manifestation. And so slowly, and Mircea Eliade was extremely effective here. His little book, Myth and Reality, slowly it occurred that myth is very much like a second nature. Myth is like a second nature. Nature is not objective. It's a matrix of change. Myth is not objective. It also is a matrix of change. But the changes in nature are on the electromagnetic spectrum, and the changes in myth are on the cadence movement spectrum of human sensibility. And that we are so much an integral part of nature that our myth cadences fit into the electromagnetic spectrum. They actually fit. And when they fit, there's this grand transmission. It's like from the two halves of the brain. It's like that river crossing over from nature to myth melds and makes what we would call a world. So that myth became the world of culture, the world of society, the tribal level, but also the level at which the ego comes into being. The ego is a mythic manifestation. Where existence happens in ritual, the ego and society and culture happen in myth. The energeia gestalts of nature very much become expressed in the energized gestalts of myth. And in this way, myth and nature are related together almost like two wheels. And when those two wheels are aligned, that's like the royal chariot. And the rider in that chariot is one's real existence. But a peculiar thing happens. We could see it. I remember when Hansen's Bearpaw finished, and his great grandnephew was doing the translating into English. But even before the last section was translated in English, when Hansen's Bearpaw finished the story of Scarface in the original Algonquin language, it was unbelievable quality. The blind old 100-year man just delivering it absolutely with such gentility that it penetrated. The greatest force, says Lao Tzu, penetrates. And the head of the whole Blackfoot Nation at that time, a man named Rufus Goodstriker, stood up. And he made a vow instantly before this huge population of people. He said, I have been a Hollywood Indian all my life. I renounce it here and now. I'm going to let my hair grow and I'm going to braid it. I want my grandchildren to see a man in braids and be proud of it. Because you see, myth has a reality, and when you are touched, your whole existence lights up and bridges over into your real nature. It was colossal experience. It really happened. And the insight for me at that time, an insight that was lacking previously in the symbols course, was that language interiorizes. It carries like a solvent that dissolves into the body. It carries our experience of the external world inside. So that the interior of the body now is energized by an experience which is language indexed. Why is it language indexed? It's language indexed because language was the solvent that carried it inside. And that the whole body, the entire body, was that interior mind. The body itself is capable of interiorization. Not just the brain, the whole body. That's when the symbols course took a radical change. Up until then, the symbols course was always about the mind. It was always about symbolic mentality, which is surely true, but it has to be extended because the whole body is wise. Hands are wise. And then all of the examples that anyone can see. Here in Los Angeles, just a mile from here, you have the Braille Institute, one of the best places in the whole world where the blind are taught to read with their fingers. They don't read with their hands, dissociated from their brain, but they read. And the sense of touch can be so sensitized. I used to go down to Los Angeles City Hall about 20 years ago because there was a man that sold the magazines there at the entrance, and he was blind, and he could tell the difference in denominations of dollar bills by touch. And, you know, phony wizards like me are always amazed at the natural magic of just the ordinary person that has to make a living and has learned. I used to watch him, and I couldn't see how he could do it. Because it isn't a function of seeing it. It's a function of interiorizing existence. And the body knows. And the great example of it are babies. Babies' bodies are incredibly intelligent. It's just that they are so quick that they don't put any of the steps in between that we would think are intelligent. All the discursive steps are collapsed, telescoped together, and they're just instantly, like Zen masters, exactly what they need to be. Exactly. The baby is the primordial mind. The baby is the primordial mind. And if you ever see really small babies, when they've shrugged off the whole experience of being, you know, pulled out and slapped around and coddled and diapered, after about 3 months, you can see in the eyes of the baby absolute clarity, the clarity of high dharma. You look into a 3-month-old baby's eyes, and what you see is this pristine, gentle directness, this penetration. And what they respond to, their first response is to the voice tone of whoever they have bonded with, the mother or the mother image. And after they get the voice tone, a couple of weeks later, the facial gestalt forms so that they smile when they see the mother's face, whether she speaks or not. It's uncanny. It's exactly what happens in reality. We first learn by the interiorization of language, and when that interiorization is carried to a flash point of integration, rippling out from that comes this ability to recognize the unique exact gestalt of that one who is related to us. As a mother, as a father, as a lover, whatever it is the most remarkable thing in the universe. The recognition instantaneously of personality by facial gestalt is one of the most superior things that there is in the cosmos. In his Ascent of Man series, Jacob Bernowski set a whole array of instrumentation so that one could have recordings from the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And an object was placed before all these machines, and you were shown on the graphs, on the dials, on the charts, on the monitors, what was being received. What was this by X-ray? What was this by infrared? What was this by radio wave? And in that whole array, complete, of electromagnetic spectrum, the only place that you could see that the object was a human face, so that you could recognize who it was one single narrow band called visual light. The human eye is made precisely to hold the reality of personality in focus. That is its primary evolutionary nature. The eye is meant to see character, personality, to uniqueness, to exact oneness. The ancient symbol for it was the Ujit in Egypt, the mystic eye. The eye of Horus sees. What does the eye of Horus see? Sees you. In that whole first ecology of nature, of ritual, of myth, of symbol, nowhere in that whole ecology does the person exist. It isn't an opinion, it's a fact. There's no person in nature. You can look forever. Not there. What's there in ritual action is existence, not a person. The existential occurrence is quite distinctly different. It's very objective. Quite distinctly different from person. What occurs in myth is ego, supported by its cultural matrix, indexed by its societal hierarchy, stylized by its tribal nature. Not a person. In symbols, as one condenses, as one gets down into the mind, as one comes into that interiority, you can become adept at that and you can find that there's no one there. The greatest example of it is the historical Buddha. And his statement was anatta, no self. There's no trace whatsoever. And so in that entire ecology, the person does not exist. Or to put it more precisely, the person doesn't occur. Yet we know persons occur. We know that it is so primordial that 4-month-old babies can recognize persons. What's going on here? In ancient times, this was called the mystery. This was the mystery. It was secret. Not secret because someone didn't want to tell you, but that you could not be told in the way you were. You had to change in order to be told. You had to change radically. You had to be taken out of that entire ecology of nature, ritual, myth, symbol. You had to be born again out of that. You had to be rescued out of that. You had to be saved out of that, delivered out of that. To where? To another world, to somewhere else, to something transcendent, to something more eminent, many words, many languages. The Buddha simply said the other shore. When that whole ecology of nature is taken far enough, a universal principle comes into play. The best writing on this is done by Carl Jung. And in Jung's works, the frequently difficult to find visions seminars of 1930s. 2-volume set. In the first volume, privately published they were. On page 122, the headline is the Greek term in antiodromia. In antiodromia. It means that when something goes completely this way, it suddenly changes and is exactly its opposite. That opposites displace each other at extremities. If something becomes 100% negative, it is all of a sudden positive. In antiodromia. Jung, in writing, says that he got his understanding from his friend Richard Wilhelm, who translated the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching and many other works. Wilhelm was a German Protestant missionary son, and his father was stationed in northern China around Beijing, and as a young man he was up in the western hills outside of Beijing, and he went into a Taoist monastery, and the old Taoist master there took Wilhelm aside, and he showed him the garden outside. And he saw that Wilhelm could see that he had this innate quality. He'd been born in China, he could think in Chinese, he could dream in Chinese. And so he told him in Chinese that this garden was not the real garden, that the real garden was inside the temple, inside the monastery. And so he took him in, and there in a room, on a tabletop, was the garden outside in miniature. And he said, this garden is more real than that garden out there. And when he saw that Wilhelm was following him, he said, but this garden is a transition garden. The real garden is here. And he showed him his thumbnail. And on the thumbnail was a micro-miniature garden of exactly what was outside, what was on the table. And when he saw that Wilhelm was concentrating on that and he could see, one is reminded of Roger Bacon's admonition that the medieval monks in monasteries were asked not to polish their fingernails because they would see their own reflection and it would take them out of their habitual copying of the scripts into self-introspection. You're not to polish your fingernails in monasteries. Wilhelm, looking at the thumbnail, and then the Taoist master said, this also is a transition garden. The real garden is in the pupil of the eye. And Wilhelm looked at his eyes. And the Taoist saying is that he had square pupils. It's a saying. It's an ancient Chinese saying. The only way to understand that mystery is a quotation from one of the greatest American artists, Edward Weston, the photographer. In his day books, he wrote, composition is the strongest way of seeing. Having square pupils means that you frame what you see with your whole being. You don't frame it with a diagram, but you frame it with your whole existence, your whole experience, your whole essence. And when you do so, you drop out of nature. You drop out of nature. It's an alchemical process. You actually precipitate out of nature. You're no longer in nature. Where you are cannot be talked about as long as you're in nature. If you're in nature, where that is a mystery. That's the beyond. No one knows. But when you're there, nature no longer occurs, but this occurs. Whatever the this is, it occurs. It happens. We call it today vision. Its name in ancient times was magic. Magic. But just so you don't get antsy, it's the magic that is the foundation of science. Science comes out of that. Science does not come out of nature. What comes out of nature is participation mystique, not science. Science comes out of magic. It comes out of that vision, that beyond, that transcendental realm. And that realm begins a whole different energy mode, whereas nature always works with integration. It's like the law of gravity. It's always working. Whereas in this realm, integration is not the indexing energy at all. Differentiation is. Again, anyone in any effective therapy knows that the person is a focus of differentiation, not of integration. If you integrate, you can bring realization, but the realization is anatta. You can completely disappear. There are at least 4 or 5 dozen good meditation techniques developed by men and women across the ages. You can choose any one of them. The Hindus called it Bindu, a point which vanishes in upon itself. Euclid called it the point of no dimension. Whatever that is, it's a culmination of coming together, and when that culminates by enantiodromia, by universal law, by dharma, by, what was another term for it? Principle, li. Chinese called it li. The Confucian li. It's a principle. It's the way it works. This, in enantiodromia, the nothingness becomes everything. Realization becomes a differential mode that, if carried out, becomes eventually the cosmos. And exactly midway between that original opening out of the void and the cosmos, exactly halfway, like a focus, is the person. But the person is the fulcrum of the differential real. And the person is so important that there is no cosmos without at least one person. None whatsoever. It is absolute mystery, religious conundrum, profound. That there is a cosmos is absolute proof that at least one real person has existed as long as this cosmos has existed. If it's 15 billion years old, there's been at least one real person for at least 15 billion years. One of the nice little comic things is that there's no use in getting huffy. I love I've mentioned it several times, the wall graffiti in Hollywood one time. It read, "Stop worrying, it's 100% out of your hand." Your being pissed off is not going to affect it. Your being gloating is not going to help it. So Jung, in writing about in Angiodromia, getting it from Richard Wilhelm, from his I Ching, Jung is commenting on this dream sequence of a woman, and this woman had these primordial archetypal dreams, which were not dreams, Jung points out, because they didn't have the qualities of dream. They didn't have a time indexing quality. They didn't have a temporality that is always there in culture, always there in society, always there in the tribal level, always there in the ego. The ego always has a time. It's always late or it's always ahead. It's always in temporality. In fact, the very nature of the ego, when you bring the ego down and you catch the nude, naked, wild animal that it is, it's temporizing. That's what it does. The ego temporizes. Its eyes wild, its tongue out, it temporizes. What does Shakespeare say? Give me world enough and time. I will play forever. Who needs to be realized? So Jung writing, actually he was speaking in Zurich in the early 1930s. He spent from November of 1930 to March of 1934 on these vision seminars. He stopped when the magic was lost. They were never finished. Because you can only talk this way so long as everyone together is in the magic, either in the mystical participation or in the magic. You have to stay in that. If you drop out of that, you can't say one more thing. That's why the continuity, that's why there's a lecture today. He writes, he spoke, he said, so that we can understand that when our patient defied the giant in this vision, they're not dreams, but they're visions, vision seminars. So we can understand when our patient defied this giant, who was the world of which she mistakenly claimed to be unafraid, then the world caught her. Then she fell into the abyss, seething with fearful forms and faces, and was taken back into the river of blood from which she had emerged. Here the giant is no longer lying on the ground like Goliath hit by the stone of David. He stands over her, causes such a great shadow that she cannot see the stars of the sky. All orientation is lost. There is complete darkness, or as the I Ching would say, she is near the heart of darkness. And she is being pulled even further down, for she says, I was being sucked into the great boiling stream, and I cried out in agony, like Sophia, the Gnostic myth, like the cry of Nerea in the Nag Hammadi documents. It is Nerea's cry that brings forth the differential reverberations of deliverance. There can be no deliverance without a deliverer. There can be no deliverer without a differential energy continuum in which to exist. And so one doesn't cry out for deliverance. That's premature. One doesn't cry out for a deliverer. That's beside the point. One cries out to allow the cry to bring the ripples of that differential energy into play. That cry is always heard. Why? Because it's universal law. That is the death of the hero. It means the disappearance of the hero into the belly of the whale dragon. Then in that overwhelming darkness, even the giant disappears. Even the whale disappears. Even the dragon disappears. It's like a black hole. Like a psychic black hole. At that point, which is no point, and an angiodromia happens, is universal law. Jung, it could seem illogical to suppose that the power which has overcome one utterly disappears when one is wiped out. But that is true Chinese philosophy. If yin succeeds in swallowing and abolishing yang completely, then yang penetrates all the darkness and sets it on fire, and out comes the light again. Therefore, if yin wants to overcome yang or yang yin, if a man wants to overcome a crowd or a king wants to rule his people, he must be swallowed by the crowd. He must give himself over to them completely, because only thus can he appear in each one of them. That truth is symbolized in the Christian communion. He calls this, he says, you probably noticed that in the sequence of these visions, things are again and again developed through antiadromia. Because all energy, in order to flow, must be polar. It has to be polar. An energy that is not polarized has no dynamic. And the law, the principle of that dynamic, is that when that energy is bifurcated to the extent that it is completely on one side, it instantly becomes on the other side. Instantly. Always when a certain thing comes to a head, to the top, then it falls off and changes into the opposite. So here in the supreme moment where the darkness is absolute, even the giant dragons, whales disappear. Behold, an egg appears out of blinding whiteness, and everything begins again. By 1975, after working on this for 10 years, I didn't understand that. My second pattern in 1975 was the first semester, or the first quarter was ideas. Example, the idea of complementarity. The next one was groundings. Example, perception or language. The third one was developments. Example, historical periods. And the fourth was explorations. Example, parallel lives. I used to take a cue from old wise Plutarch and give parallel lives to show, like when I did Jung and Bertrand Russell together. Parallel lives. Completely different, yet at the same time frame. Related and yet not intentionally related. Plutarch said that the human life is so complex a form that you need a background developed enough to show the complexity of that form, and the only background that will do is another life. This is why human beings, on their personal level, live best not alone but in tandem with someone else. Because two human beings against each other can come to understand their person. Someone who prefers to live in solitude is still locked in the integral mode, is still searching for realization, and you can search forever. Or you can find it and shift to the differential mode. I hear the tea kettle whistling like a ghostly wind. But at this point, where this education was complete and all 8 sections was there, and I was developing not only these 8 sections, but a further 8 sections based on how these look from the feminine side. In other words, the 16-course cycle was going to be the whole cycle from a male side and then the whole cycle from a female side. And the initial course, the 9th course I developed, was called Images of Women, to begin exploring how all this looks from the feminine way. And that course was actually developed and actually worked. We had several hundred people in it every time it was run. The controlling statement at that time was this statement, written in August 1970. In this education, the idea is to fill in the gaps and interrelational spaces that have naturally developed in the contemporary world as a residual of increasing specialization. This specialization has taken the predominant form of well-defined subjects and accurately delineated processes. The universal application of the scientific method to entities and the logical analysis of procedure has benefited everyone by presenting reasonably clear pictures of the world. In this act of focusing, however, the background has been eliminated. The interconnecting tissue of things and their movement has disappeared, not from reality, as is so ignorantly lamented, but merely from man's microscope perspective. This education restores the consciousness of this background and the requisites of human character commensurate with that restoration. Quarter of a century ago, that's the kind of language that I used. This whole program, I was searching for a place to put it. I resigned. I left Canada. I had my secretary at the time, because I was a department head, write 60 letters to 60 schools to see what they were doing with education, with advanced programs like this. I got no replies. Well, I got 17 forms. If you want to have employment, you fill out these forms and send it to the right place. And 43, no replies. By that time, there was a History of Consciousness program at UC Santa Cruz. So I phoned up there and I talked to Norman O'Brown, who was the head of the program. He said, "Don't come here." He said, "I'm leaving." I said, "Isn't Stephen Tallman there?" "No, he left last year. We're all getting out." I said, "Well, the program was founded by Maurice Nathanson. I know that it had good beginnings. I was around when it began in 1966. I knew those people." "Yeah," he said, "it had good potential. We're getting out. It's no longer here." University-itis has taken over. So I searched around on my own. I came to Los Angeles out of pure vision. I let the old intuitive visionary computer go, and it landed me at the corner of Rowena and Lowry. I had no idea where that was. I mean, in terms of reality. I had no idea whatsoever. I didn't realize it was 2 blocks from the Philosophic Research Society. I had never heard of that. I had no idea at all where I was. But I came 2,400 miles. I came within 2 blocks of where I would be for 12 years. That's not bad insight. Unless you're going to another star, in which case it's very poor. That little angle. You can't get to Eridani by guessing. I found the exact right place. I had been in Los Angeles for about a year. I set up a center called the Bodhisattva Center. And I brought from Canada the best of all of the Tibetan Rinpoches. Karma Tinley. And I sponsored him at my center, Bodhisattva, to give a 10-day Dharma course because I could see that nobody was understanding anything very much. Basic ABCs. 10-day seminar on Tibetan language. You can't understand the Vajrayana unless you understand that's in the Tibetan language. And that the Tibetan language, unlike any other language in the world, never was spoken by peasants. It was made by geniuses to express exactly the Vajrayana and only that. Tibetan is a made language, a visionary language. It doesn't have cultural roots. It doesn't have anything in the integral ecology at all. It's purely differential. And that's why Tibetan as a language is purely a magical language. So he gave lectures on the Tibetan language, then on the Karmapas, because no one was understanding what a lineage is, and then on Tibetan Buddhism, the Vajrayana. His portrait is on the wall there. There's Karma Tinley with his signature on the wall. And in tandem with bringing Karma Tinley, my old friend Thich Chen Han, the head of the University of Oriental Studies, wanted to do some work together. And so with them, with my two Dharma friends, I found that the right way to handle this education in the West was to take it to a technological university. And I thought about Caltech because Caltech would be the perfect place. But I found a technological school in the southern part of Los Angeles. I found Northrop University. And Northrop University was perfect. Its president at the time was a man named B.J. Schell, who was an organizational genius. He was an engineer by profession. And he had taken Northrop University from just being a technical school to beginning to open it up. He had founded a law school, and he was going to found a interdisciplinary humanities school, and I was going to be the person to do it. And so here's the whole humanities program for Northrop University, and it was all set to run. In 1976, I was coming on staff. We were going to do it all. We had the technical resources. We had everything all set. And the very first introductory course to get people going was called Transcendental America. And here's the outline, typed by BJ's secretary herself. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, The Portable Thomas Jefferson, The Deerslayer by Fenimore Cooper, Emerson's Angle of Vision, Thoreau's Journals, The Portable Whitman, The Wilderness World of John Muir. And then Northrop University lost 25% of its students overnight. The Ayatollah took over in Iran and cut off the funds, and 25% of Northrop students were Iranians. And you can't take 25% out of an academic budget. I don't care how genius you are. You can't work it. So it had to be deferred, and when it was deferred, of course, BG had a lot of people that wanted his job, and pretty soon it was just unworkable. And by 1978, it was apparent that it was just never going to work out. And so I let it go. I did what you would do. I just let it go. At that time, I'd put 13 years in and had taken as far as I could, and so I just let the education go. I didn't speak. I didn't teach. I forgot about it. But once you live in the magical world, it works. This is God's truth, I'm going to tell you. I ended up in an Irish bar, the Blarney Castle on Western near 3rd. And I was sitting at the bar around Christmas time, nursing a beer, what else? And a woman came up, an older woman, not attractive, but interesting, and she got into a conversation with me. And after about an hour, you know how bar conversations go, or maybe you don't. It's an old-fashioned American way of pastiming. She said, "You ought to meet my boss. You'd really get along with him." And I said, "Well, who's your boss?" She said, "Manly Hall." And I did want to say, that occult kook? But I was in the Blarney Castle, and it was Christmas time, and I had at least 3 hours head start on my soberness. And so I said, "Sure." What else are you going to say? I mean, that's as much as you can get out, right? Sure. So she said she went to the phone and set up an appointment for the next day to go and chat with him. This is my favorite photograph of him. This photograph is being taken by a photographer. Turned out it's a woman photographer, the second wife of Dr. Stephen Heller. She's the photographer, and she's taking this photograph of him, and as she's backing away, she's tripping, and she's falling. And as she's falling, she took the photograph mid-fall, and the expression on Mr. Hall's face is, he's watching her fall. One of the best photographs ever taken of him because of the absolute intensity of the existential moment of how he really was. When he stopped all the masks and all of the obliqueness, he was really a king. He was like Osiris. He was really there. And he, in his beautiful great-grandfatherly Irish wisdom way, shamed me into coming back. He said something to the effect, what a waste. All that education that they gave you. All that talent that you were born with. What a waste. He didn't say it in so many words, but he conveyed that. And so what can you do? You go back to work. And so that was 1979. At that time, the education had a very peculiar quality to it when I came back to work. My two closest friends were Theodore Sturgeon, the science fiction writer, who is definitely an extraterrestrial. He is a Martian orchid. There's no way that he is human. Dr. Heller and I and Theodore Sturgeon were over here at a restaurant not far from here, and we came out about midnight one night, and I had a flat tire in my car. Well, Dr. Heller and I sort of tried to figure out, well, what are we going to do? We're not AAA members. I mean, guys like us are not, we don't function well in the world. And meanwhile, Sturgeon went over and he opened up the trunk and got the stuff and he changed the tire. And by the time Dr. Heller and I had agreed that, well, we've got enough money, let's call a cab and share a cab, it changed the tire. And so the next day, I went over to get the tire fixed, and the guy was looking at the jack, and he said, how did you change this tire? He said, this jack doesn't work. I said, I know it works. I saw it work last night. He said, there are no gears on it. There are no teeth. There are no ratchets. It can't work. And I looked at it, and there were none. Sturgeon had changed the tire with a tire jack that had no gears. So when I say to you that he's extraterrestrial, just take it from me. He definitely was. And my other good friend was A.E. Van Vogt, a science fiction writer. And Sturgeon and Van Vogt were especially influential in seeing that the second year was kind of prosaic. The second year was a sequential development of what I thought the first year was about, when actually that's irrelevant. What I think it's about doesn't make any difference at all. That's an egotistical projection. That the basic fact was, the truth was, the mystery was, I didn't know what the second year was about. I intuited that there was a second part. What it was, I didn't know. It was like I had done the masculine form and I hadn't done the feminine form because I was still imagining myself masculine. And so all my projections were linearly lined up with what I had done. It took a while, as you'll think about this over the next year, and some of you will get it. It took me a while to realize that I had missed the point completely of the second half. I had not understood it at all. Or rather, I had understood it in terms that made it impossible for me to address it realistically. And so I asked the chief, I asked Manley, I said, I'm stuck. He said, the only thing that you can do is that old hunting process of starting to make your circles. You make a sachet in a circle one way and come back. You make your sachet in an opposite way and come back. And you keep doing that. You keep widening. And eventually, by the sheer activity of having done that, you will index the entire terrain of whatever it is that you're in such a way that where you started from will be the focal point of the entire balanced pattern. And so that's what I did at the Philosophic Research Society for 12 years. I made sachets through all the world's culture, all of the civilizations, just like somebody with a fishing net out on the wide ocean trying to find the school of fish and doesn't have any idea even that there are currents or shoals. Doesn't know anything at all. But after a while, you get to know. After a while, you understand. And by 1983, after about 4 years, I finally got the first intuition about the second year. I mean, it was just there. And that's where this place came from. This place came in the autumn of 1983. This place came exactly at the same time that I finally got the first realistic inspiration, vision of what it was that was going on. But there was no way to develop it, no way to force it at all, except just to continue that pattern, which allowed for the pilot light to be lit. And so I had to do that. It took another 7 years. And the chief was always there like a grandfather, just saying, just keep the activity constant. Because if you break it, what will happen is that the old ego pattern will project itself and take over. Whereas if you just keep it continuously, if you keep in the game, you're not going to be a spectator. It's like a major league pitcher who always, they say now, you have to stay within yourself in order to pitch the game. And if you stay within yourself, nobody's going to hit your stuff. They can't hit your stuff. There's no way they can hit your stuff. If you've ever seen a major league pitcher really get into his game, it's like that. Or an artist who gets into his work. Or a mother who gets into her child. Or a man who gets into his work. There's no way, as long as you stay in that you can miss. Manly said when he was taught by the Morongo Indians to shoot bow and arrow, at first he tried the archery thing, and they said, no, we don't aim. We don't aim like that. Well, how do you shoot a bow and arrow? You raise it to your hip and shoot immediately. Well, how can you hit anything? Well, because you're one with the target, you can't miss. And he learned to shoot that way. And he also learned to love the desert so much that he bought an interest in a gold mine one time up there, filled with rattlesnakes. That's another story. I used to drive out in this old Model T, and because of the pressure from the radiator and everything, his friend Paul Fogg had to sit on the hood to keep it down so that it wouldn't blow. A lot of stories. The second year took about 7 years to unfold. By 1990, I had finally come to understand how you got to science. It was only after that 1989 course on Science and the Spirit that I finally saw how the second year came to a complete realization, and that the missing aspect was the disease of our time. Because you can't get to science unless you master history. And that history is a process, much like myth. Nature and myth are processes. They're not objectively there at all. They're dynamic processes. And vision in the same way is a dynamic process. It's not objectively there. Magic is a process, not objectively there. And history is the same thing. It's not objectively there. It's a process. What is objectively there is existence, mind, person, and cosmos. Those are real. Those are objectively there. But they only precipitate out of those processes that are preludes to them by the principle of enantiodromia. There's no way that you can get to the cosmos until you get out of history. And there's no way to get out of history except to complete it. And that releases you from it. Now, when you start talking this way, you begin to recognize the last 500 years of utopian political theory, beginning with Thomas More, running through the United States and the French Revolution. And everybody has talked this way, and they mean it, except that now one can understand what it was they were saying. There's no way for humanity to be released, to be free, to go to the stars until we emerge from this history. And this history is at a place of complete blank madness. Nothing on this planet really works anymore. It's all inertia. It's all bluff. It's all supposition. It's all projection. Nothing is working. And nothing will work. But if we bring it to a closure, the right closure, we're free to go. We're free to go and live in any number of pluralistic worlds without end, world without end. Possibilities that have no limitations whatsoever. It's not so far away. It's just around the corner. But it's a corner that cannot be turned. It's a corner that has to be there because we stopped trying to get there. Now, I did a whole page. This is called Theory of Education, this particular lecture. And the last item that needs to be mentioned is that no one can let go, either in realization or in being free in the cosmos, without compassion. Because the closer that you get to those that in enantiodromia, the more all the resistances come up. The resistances of existence, the resistances of ego, the resistances of mind, all of them. And the only way to deal with them is to dissolve them in compassion. And what gets in the way is there's a projection of idiot compassion, so-called. That is non-selective compassion. Compassion for everything, like a Pollyanna, is compassion for nothing. For compassion to be real, compassion has to be for the person. That's the real focus. For someone. And when compassion is there for someone, it covers everything. If we learn compassion for even just one person, we have learned it permanently. It's like learning to ride a bicycle. You never can get it because it becomes part of the kinesthetic balance of the psychic energy. That compassion is not taught in the most important place. It's not taught in the education where it belongs. And so people are fleeing outside to go and find it outside. But when you find it outside, you find it in a form where it just simply is given to you and there's no connection with the work to be done. There's no connection with the problems. There's no connection with history or anything. So that's compassion with a little c. It's real. It works. But compassion without the quotation marks is where it's put into the maturity. And so this education begins by generating a field of inquiry and allowing that field of inquiry to do its double attractor infinity sign motion, both together. And so next Saturday, and there'll be some new students that are going to come in and join us and start. We'll start the second year which as recently as about 5 years ago was still very surprising to me. That differential realm. The two objective realities that will be there is your person and the cosmos. They're both very real, extremely real. All one can say is that they are so real that it's not only you're trying to get to them, they're trying to get to you. And the discovery of one's own person is like a meeting. It's like the meeting between Jefferson and Lafayette. After 50 years, after the Revolutionary War, they just each said one word. Lafayette said, Jefferson! And Jefferson said, Lafayette.